The term queer reading refers to the practice of critically examining a piece of media and analyzing its elements like the characters, relationships, and potential metaphors in order to unearth queer meanings in ostensibly straight texts. In his book Flaming Classics, Queering the Film Canon, the queer studies scholar Alexander Doty introduces the practice of queer reading with this quote: "Classic texts and personalities actually can be more queer suggestive than openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual texts. That is, the coding of classic or otherwise mainstream texts and personalities can often yield a wider range of non-straight readings because certain sexual things could not be stated baldly." The practice of queer reading has a long history, but most of these readings focus exclusively on reading queerness into character sexualities without examining how the process of queer reading could apply to gender as well. As a queer person who spends a not insignificant portion of my free time theorizing about fictional characters, I've basically been doing queer readings for years, just without any theoretical basis or taking it very seriously. Back to Flaming Classics, Alexander Doty argues against the idea that queer readings are necessarily against the grain or subcultural, or that queer readings co-opt quote-unquote straight media and do something to it. Instead, he views every text as already potentially queer. There's a lot of research out there about queer readings, but nearly everything I found was limited to reading characters as sexual minorities, not many that read characters' gender as potentially queer, that is, trans or non-binary. Based on the history of trans characters in media, I was surprised. For the vast majority of cinematic history, trans people have been depicted at best as jokes,
Einhorn is a man!
and at worst as terrifying and unstable villains. Even the progressive representation of more recent years tends to fall flat if it relies on stereotypes or makes a character's transness into their only character trait. Often this occurs because these characters are written by cis people who don't fully grasp the complexities of trans people's identities and lives.
I've felt like this my whole life. Growing up, I was really confused. I thought I was just a tomboy. No matter what I did, I never felt at home in my own skin. I never felt like my body fit who I was on the inside.
Whether we realize it or not, media like TV shows and movies forms the basis for a lot of how we understand the world and learn to interact with other people. That means that harmful, derogatory representation can genuinely inform how viewers see and interact with a particular group of people. It also means that we feel this very human need to see our lives reflected back to us. When we see people like ourselves on the screen making friends and falling in love, it helps us feel seen and validated. We're reassured that people like us deserve to exist and be loved. So I think the practice of queer reading can offer a way for us to meet this need, not by waiting around for better writing, but by reworking the ways we're expected to interpret a character's coding, or by looking at elements of the plot as metaphors for queer experiences. When I finally came across an example of a trans reading in my research, I was hooked on the idea. This example was the article No One Makes It Out Alive by Casey Plett and Morgan M. Page. The authors, both of whom are trans writers, read Little Shop of Horrors, specifically the characters of Seymour and Audrey, as a trans story. I won't go too into detail with my summary since I highly recommend that you read the article for yourself, but the authors do a lot of really interesting things with their analysis that helped me start thinking about approaching this project as a more scholarly venture. The authors conclude the article by pointing out the value we can find in reading trans identity into characters who aren't specifically characterized that way. Because the characters aren't explicitly written as trans, they don't have to meet specific standards of representation or hold up questions of authenticity. Instead, they can serve as metaphors for the painful and difficult elements of trans life that mainstream media has failed to communicate. This process is, in some small way, an act of resistance. Resistance against not only the tendency of mainstream media to exclude stories about trans people and the shortage of trans writers for high-grossing TV shows and movies, but also resistance against the history of derogatory representation of trans people in cinema. Even without authentic representation of characters who are canonically identified as trans, there's a lot of value to be found in queer readings. When looking at characters whose identities aren't coded to represent us, we're not constrained by who we're told is supposed to be like us. We have more freedom to find ways to connect to a character's life through metaphors and analogies, not necessarily relying on cut-and-dried experiences that mirror the real world one-to-one. Basically, instead of relying on someone else's ability to tell an authentic story about our lives, through critical viewing and reception, we can interpret a character's life through the perspective of our own experiences, in order to create new meaning. Ultimately, I think this gives us the chance to see representation and validation based in more nuanced interpretations than just accepting a trans character as good representation based on a label alone. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with Riverdale? Well, Riverdale is an interesting subject for queer and trans readings, because the show itself is a queer reading of its source material, the Archie comics. Not to mention the 2003 play written by the Riverdale showrunner, in which Archie from the Archie comics comes out as gay and moves to New York City. That's a whole other story, but if you want to learn more about it, Google Archie's Weird Fantasy. Several characters from the comics, including Cheryl Blossom and Moose Mason, were originally straight or had unnamed sexualities, but they show up in Riverdale with a variety of queer identities. Although Jughead has a girlfriend, excluding several early episodes, we see no mention of his sexuality. As Dodie states, this doesn't rule out the possibility that he could be understood as bisexual, or for that matter, as a closeted gay person. For queer viewers of the show who are, consciously or subconsciously, looking for representations of ourselves, mainstream media tells us that we should only see our sexuality and gender represented in the characters who are specifically identified as queer. However, for several reasons, I disagree with the idea that our perceptions of queerness are strictly limited to characters who are directly identified as such. Firstly, there aren't any trans characters in the show. Second, the canonically queer characters fall flat partially because they rely on stereotypes, but more importantly because they're not main characters. They're not granted enough screen time to carry the kind of real-world, emotionally invested problems that are presented in Jughead's character. According to normative readings of Riverdale, Jughead is not culturally coded to connect with my life experiences of being queer and trans. Despite this, however, I think several elements of his character and plot lines are reflective of queer and trans life, especially the emotional, affective elements that Casey Plett and Morgan Page recalled in their reading of Little Shop of Horrors. These are the kinds of experiences that are difficult to communicate, even for experienced writers. Inspired by Jose Munoz's book Disidentifications, I resist the show's encoded directives to watch and identify as heterosexual, and instead, I plan on recycling, rethinking, and reconstructing these encoded messages to tell a different story. In my analysis, I'll mainly be focusing on the first season of Riverdale because it provides most of the useful backstory and because it's the only season where the characters are single most of the time so they can actually interact without the pressure of pre-existing relationship dynamics. Jughead plays a unique role in this series. He's the narrator, but we don't see a lot of him in the first few episodes. He tends to stay in the background, literally and figuratively. But we do get a few crucial scenes that hint at Jughead's backstory, especially when it comes to his relationship with Archie. The first interaction Jughead has with another character comes at the end of episode 1, when Jughead is sitting in Pop's, the local diner, and Archie walks in looking for their mutual friend Betty. Earlier in the episode, Betty kind of asked Archie out, and Archie's planning on telling her that he doesn't feel the same way. Here's how Jughead sets up the scene.
It was midnight when my old friend Archie Andrews arrived at the one place in town that was still open. He was looking for the girl next door. Instead, he found me.
So Jughead's immediately setting himself up as a parallel to Archie's first love interest in the show. The scene that follows is tense, even uncomfortable. During the conversation, we find out that Jughead and Archie used to be close, but something that happened over the summer changed that.
Can I sit, Jughead?
If you want. Varsity. Does that make you, what, Mr. Popular Football God now?
No. In fact, I'm kind of terrified I lost my best friend tonight.
If you mean Betty, whatever happened, just talk to her, man. It'll go a long way. Would have gone a long way with me.
This scene feels like a conversation between exes. Jughead's literally giving Archie relationship advice by saying, "Don't treat her the way you treated me," placing himself as a parallel to Betty in seeking and never quite attaining Archie's romantic attention. Throughout the rest of the season, Archie and Jughead make up and become close friends again. However, Jughead always maintains a sort of precarious position. He's never explicitly a love interest for Archie, but the two of them have known each other since childhood, and the history of their relationship is emphasized throughout the season. Whatever happened between the two of them over the summer has forced Jughead to recognize that things are changing between himself and Archie. Archie seems interested in dating and sex in a way that Jughead just isn't. Archie pursues various girlfriends within the first season alone. Meanwhile, Jughead spends the season competing with Archie's girlfriends for his attention and eventually pursuing his own relationship with Betty after Archie lets her down easy at the end of the pilot. I don't think we're supposed to associate Jughead with attraction to women, and given his reputation from the comics, that's not really a surprise. When he and Betty get together, it's not because of the kind of physical attraction or sexual attention that we see in the case of Archie and Veronica. Instead, Jughead and Betty connect because they're both interested in writing and they bond over their family issues. There's virtually no sexual tension or even any sexual dynamics implied between them at all until the final episode of the first season, and even that scene only lasts a few seconds before they get interrupted. Basically, it feels like Jughead pursues Betty because he needs a friend. He wants the kind of companionship that it's implied he had with Archie before the summer, but he doesn't necessarily want a romantic relationship. Throughout the rest of the season, Jughead struggles with the expectations that are placed on him to act like a straight dude. One of the first insights we get into Jughead's backstory comes at the end of episode 3, where it's revealed that Jughead is homeless. He was living at his place of employment, the drive-in theater, because of problems at home that we don't know much about yet.
How long?
Well, since they shut down the drive-in. That's where I was living before.
Why the hell are you not living at home?
Truth is, things aren't good at home.
With your dad?
Yeah.
According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 1 in 5 trans people will experience homelessness in their lifetime. Varying estimates place the percentage of homeless youth who identify as LGBTQ as anywhere between 20 to 40%. Many, if not most of these individuals are homeless because they've been kicked out of their homes due to their identity. While the circumstances surrounding Jughead's housing are different, he did choose to leave because of family tensions that led him to feel unsafe at home. The stress that housing insecurity adds to his daily life is reminiscent of the life circumstances faced by significant numbers of trans people. During the drive-in scene, we're also briefly introduced to Jughead's father, who is a member of a gang called the Southside Serpents. The Serpents get a bad rap in Riverdale, especially from people living on the north side of the town.
The Serpents are dangerous. They're drug dealers.
What? Says who?
Jughead and his family are from the South Side, which, like the South Side of Chicago, is often stereotyped as a dangerous, shady place because the South Side has higher rates of poverty and crime than the North Side, and of course there's some gang activity. Although he's from the South Side, Jughead goes to school at Riverdale High on the north side of town, where being affiliated with the Serpents doesn't exactly get you a warm welcome.
Southside trash.
Jughead keeps this information about his family secret to avoid getting bullied even more than he already does.
Jughead, kid like you, raised on the wrong side of the tracks by a deadbeat dad, bullied by kids like Jason Blossom.
One on the outside.
Jughead's home life makes him feel like an outsider among his North Side friends, but as long as no one knows, he can keep it a secret and make it look, on the surface, like he's one of them. He doesn't want to risk ruining the few friendships he's made by telling everyone that his dad is part of the Serpents. Unfortunately, Archie finds out.
You were protecting him. That's why you didn't tell me.
Relax. What happened?
Please.
Did you know Jughead's father's a serpent?
No.
I read this plotline as an allegory for trans disclosure. That is, the disclosure that someone is transgender. Trans people are often pressured to disclose their gender identity and treated as deceitful if they don't, which places the blame on a trans person for not wanting to potentially endanger themselves by outing themselves before they're ready. For people who are reluctant to tell others that they're trans, whether for fear of social stigma or more extreme danger, it's already an incredibly difficult decision to make. Of course, honesty is crucial in relationships, but honesty shouldn't come at the price of safety. It might take time to establish the trust and safety necessary to share such a personal element of your life and identity. Hence why this scene feels like a metaphor. Jughead didn't get the chance he deserved to decide for himself when and how he wanted to share that information. His private life was disclosed to the public, and he ended up getting blamed and having to apologize for not telling his friends sooner. Similar, although on a much less serious scale, to a trans person being outed without their consent. Even Betty, Jughead's new girlfriend, feels like she's been lied to, despite the fact that she's never even met his dad. However, after the initial reveal, the two of them have a private conversation where Betty reassures Jughead that learning about his dad doesn't change how she feels about him. And in my opinion, this quote could have been ripped straight from a Love, Simon type show about a trans character.
Jughead, if we're gonna be together, I want to know who you are. All of it.
Okay.
Okay.
In the book Performing Disidentifications, Jose Munoz says queers are people who have failed to turn around to the interpolating call of heteronormativity. In Season 1, Episode 10, we see this call of heteronormativity affecting how Jughead sees himself once he and Betty start officially dating.
You know before how you said you didn't want Betty knowing where you were living. Is that because you and Betty...
We may have had a moment.
It's totally cool, I get it. No worries, I'm just curious.
As Betty's boyfriend, Jughead feels like he's being pulled to fulfill a role that he's not quite comfortable with or ready for. He's expected to fill the role of a heterosexual teen guy and good boyfriend, and he feels like that's at odds with who he is. He doesn't want to change himself or anything else to fit into this new role.
Am I expected to come to this thing?
Of course. You're Betty's boyfriend, so. Oh my god, you guys, relax. It's just a word that starts with the letter B.
Jughead just wants things to stay the same as they've always been. His birthday's coming up, and all he wants is to continue his yearly tradition with Archie, where they go see a double feature movie together and celebrate with a quiet night in.
John Landis, double feature at the Bijou. American Werewolf in London and Animal House.
That's awesome, except you're going with Betty instead.
Archie, who has way more experience with dating than Jughead does, doesn't understand why Jughead's so resistant to the idea. Jughead doesn't get it. It doesn't feel right that things have to change just because he's Betty's boyfriend now. In my opinion, this could be indicative of a deeper issue. Maybe Jughead feels uncomfortable with his changing roles because being in a straight relationship doesn't feel right, for reasons he doesn't yet understand. He's forced to confront what it means to be a guy dating a girl and what's expected of him to be a good boyfriend.
It doesn't matter, Jughead, you're her boyfriend now.
What does that mean?
Maybe what he really needed from Betty was a close friend. Someone he could confide in and connect with over their shared family problems. Someone who gets liking writing more than sports, who supports his goals and achievements, but not necessarily someone he's expected to be romantic with. Jughead is left feeling like he's not the right kind of person to be Betty's boyfriend. Like there are irreconcilable differences that mean he'll never be able to connect with her in the way she wants. Eventually, Jughead breaks down under the pressure from feeling forced to fit into a role that's drastically different from who he is as a person. He's very aware of the fact that he isn't what most people would consider normal. This has become part of his identity. However, despite being somewhat confident about his status as a social outcast, it becomes painful when he feels like who he is as a person makes him fundamentally unable to be a good boyfriend to Betty. The conflict finally reaches a breaking point when Betty asks Jughead why he's so upset.
Doesn't it ever occur to you just how different we are? Like, on a cellular DNA kind of level? You're a straight-A student. You're a cheerleader, for God's sakes. You're the perfect girl next door.
I hate that word.
I'm the damaged, loner outsider from the wrong side of the tracks. Betty, come on. Who are we kidding? We're on borrowed time.
And the most infamous scene from the entire show, the one that lived rent-free in all of our heads for most of 2017.
In case you haven't noticed, I'm weird. I'm a weirdo. I don't fit in, and I don't want to fit in. Have you ever seen me without this stupid hat on? That's weird.
Even though that line is undeniably uncomfortable, when I think about my high school self, it's hard for me to not relate to Jughead's enthusiastic insistence that he's a weird, abnormal outsider. In high school, I also found comfort in my self-identified weirdness. It was a defensive response to my environment as an introverted trans kid. If society refused to value my life or beliefs or to listen to what I had to say, then I didn't want to value society's beliefs either. Some trans people, including myself, when facing the possibility of being excluded and ignored by society, instead choose to reject society as a whole, to avoid the emotional toll of seeking and being denied support. Even just this far in the show, we've seen Jughead get criticized and rejected for his home life, his family, his hobbies, his personality, the list goes on. He probably doesn't have a lot of trust in other people at this point. Jughead's insistence that he's weird, that he doesn't fit in and doesn't want to, can be read as this kind of emotional safety-driven rejection. In fact, later in the same episode, Jughead communicates openly and directly about his insecurities, in a way that feels reminiscent of many coming-out scenes.
Maybe I'm scared. Of getting hurt. Being rejected. For being myself.
Jughead's dissatisfaction with heteronormative social roles, his pervasive feeling of isolation and separation from his quote-unquote normal friends, and the painful disclosure of his personal life all serve as unexpectedly powerful metaphors for elements of trans life that I've never really seen addressed in media before. In my opinion, queer readings and critical reception are survival mechanisms for queer viewers, especially trans viewers. We need to believe that we're human, that we're worthy of care and love, even as we watch people like ourselves suffer violent, tragic fates on screen. We have to learn to see ourselves in characters who weren't intended to represent us, because media is a crucial part of how we learn to view the world, which is to say, how we learn that we deserve a place in it. We don't need to rely on TV or movie producers to tell us our stories. We take the parts we identify with and forge representations of our own from bits of shows, movies, and pieces of our own creation. If mainstream media won't tell us that we deserve to be loved, we learn it on our own by insisting on reading ourselves into their narratives. By taking part in this work, we say, I see myself, I love myself, And this time I get to tell the story.
Do you often use fictional references to make sense of your situation?
Yes, I do.